Joyce.
And I'm Jess, and this is the Down to Earth podcast.
So we're back. It's kind of a miracle. Here we are starting season 2. I guess this is a redo, right? Because we tried to record a couple months ago, and it didn't really work.
Was that last year?
No, it was in February. But then I moved house and there was a bunch of crazies.
We traveled a bit.
Yeah. Anyway, here we are. We got an email this week asking, or a message on some social media saying, hey, is there going to be season 2? And I was really glad to get back and say, yes, we're recording on Friday. So we had so much fun with season 1 and so much feedback, really positive. I actually thought there was going to be maybe more like pushback or, I don't know, more dialogue.
More
intensity.
angry letters.
Yeah. Or like people who are like, oh, I disagree. But we didn't really get that too much. We just got people kind of excited listening in. Which was a great experiment because we weren't sure if anybody would be interested in our nerdy theology selves.
We wondered if we would just be talking to ourselves and...
Right.
Moms and grandmas.
Right, or the banter would be boring.
But my mom and grandma.
Right, yeah. So it's just been super encouraging, I think, across the board. And all the people that we've met and who have written in just said that it's given them a lot of life. And so that's great. It gave us some juice to decide to do season 2.
Yeah, and I think this year we want to really invite you to be part of the conversation. And our hope is that throughout this entire season that you'd feel part of the discussion.
Right.
I think we're going to delve into some deep waters this year that will require discussion. And I at least know for myself that a great way to learn is through dialogue, that we actually retain more information. And when we interact with information, even when we disagree with information, it has a way of lodging itself both into our brains and our hearts. And so we want to encourage you to wrestle with some of the material just as we are.
I think that's partly what we're modeling by how we do the podcast, but also the number of people who've told me or you that they've had really great discussions with their circle of friends or somebody that they introduced the podcast to. So there's dialogue going on. We just like a little bit more of it to come toward us. What are the big questions, or the ahas, or even the pushback?
Yeah.
We'd love to hear a little bit more of that.
Yeah. So this year we're going to be organizing our season around the idea of power and authority. And for a long time I've been thinking about this idea. In fact, as I was finishing my master's, this was what I kind of threw around writing my thesis about, this idea about how Christians use their power and authority in the world. And I don't know that it's a concept that we grapple with too often, particularly for those of us that live in Western countries where access to power and authority is ubiquitous. And I think it's something that we need to be thinking about.
Right, absolutely.
And we need to be... looking internally at ourselves and then also looking externally to the systems that we are part of.
Yeah.
And
we're complicit.
Yeah.
In some ways. You know, when I mentioned to people that the whole of season 2 is going to be on power, they kind of looked at me like, what would you say for 24 episodes about power? And I think it's important that we just say from the outset in this first episode that there's so much depth and dimension to what we probably need to wrestle with.
Yeah, and I think we all have a lot more power than we think we do.
Right.
So if you're sitting with a phone or some kind of a device listening to this podcast, by virtue of that very fact, you have a lot of power.
Right. Think about the rise of social media that's only intensified the amount of power each one of us has. Any kind of, just think about the past week, how many things have come across your feed on some platform that you're using that's some kind of campaign or crowdfunding or fund me campaign, petitioning kind of a thing. There's a guy, Clay Shirky, did a TED Talk, how social media can change history. And I think that's got nearly 2 million views. So if you haven't watched it, go ahead and bump his numbers up. But he says that the moment we are historically living in is the largest increase in expressive capability in human history. And the gist of it is that we can now be producers, not just consumers, so we have an ability to leverage our voice in ways using those kinds of platforms in social media that we've never been able to do before. So that's an exponential increase in power.
Right. So it's an opportunity, but also a responsibility. And I think some of us, maybe you're not the petitioning kind. I'm not the petitioning kind. Like, you're never going to catch me on a road with like a picketing sign. If you are, more power to you, but it's just not me. And I have had to wrestle out this opportunity we have now to stand up for things that we believe in or that we don't believe in. And part of it is, I think, for a lot of Christians, we don't want to make too many waves.
Right.
So we just want to be nice.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we really want to push into a little bit. How can we use our power responsibly in a way that honors the opportunities that we have?
Yeah, and I think sometimes we get backed into a corner and then we are, okay, now I'm going to say something about this, or now I'm going to do something about this, or now my heart's been captured about this particular thing. And then we get, moving or active, even just with our voice, even just with a pithy quote we throw out somewhere, or something that would provoke, or we share an article. I remember a while back, Barack Obama said, I'm asking you to believe not just about my ability to bring about real change in Washington, I'm asking you to believe in yours. And I think that was a shift politically that we saw maybe on the American landscape. And then follow that up with the subsequent political election in the US, and people didn't actually believe in their own power. So there's an abdicating in some ways of participation by some people who are now, maybe distraught. Here we go.
Are you going political?
Well, I'm just saying
episode 1?
That's an example. Donald Trump got elected. And then there's people who are upset about that, but they didn't use their voice. They didn't participate. Maybe they didn't vote even. Do you remember this Shane Snow article? It came out like 5 years ago. Why storytelling would be the biggest business skill in the next 5 years.
Yeah, we talked about that last season.
Did we?
Yep.
And did I tell the story about the woman, Amanda Palmer? No. Okay, so this is interesting. In 2012, a woman with sort of crazy eyebrows and a keytar strapped to her back made a video of herself wearing a kimono and holding up hand-sharpied signs on a street in Melbourne. And so Shane Snow tells the story. One by one, the signs flipped, explaining that the woman had spent the last 4 years writing songs. She was a musician and had parted ways with her record label, which had said that the cost of her next album would be a whopping $500,000. So she and her bandmates were very happy to no longer be with the label and had worked hard to create some great new music and art, but they could no longer finish producing the record on their own. She needed people's help to get it off the ground and to make what was now her business, independent music, work. Right. And this is the future of music, one of her signs read. And another, I love you. And then she posted the video on Kickstarter. So imagine that's 7 years ago, right? So we didn't really know what those kinds of platforms were going to do. In 30 days, it had raised $1.2 million.
Right.
So like almost 25,000 people pre-ordered the album, bought artwork, or simply donated money. And the album and tour became this huge success. And this artist had turned her music into a real profitable business. So if you haven't heard that story already, that woman was Amanda Palmer. And she went on to give this massively popular TED Talk about the whole affair. So she changed the game, not just for her band, but for independent musicians with that campaign. And she did it not simply by asking for money, but by telling a story. Her story, their story, right? And maybe that story impacted me a little bit differently because I'm married to a musician and I know a lot of the underbelly, if you will, of the industry. But I felt like, okay, there's power, but it's through story. That's what captivated people and their participation. There'd be a million ways that we've seen that in the last 7 years exemplified. And that's why they said it's the biggest business skill.
Right.
If you can just learn. I have a good friend here in Calgary, Ryan Shantz, who started Sumo Quote. It's like an app for businesses to build quotes really easily, right? For like in the trades or whatever. And the way he's framed it out is that the prospective customer sees their project, say it's their house or their roof or whatever, as a story. And he's actually leveraging it really well because you feel like, okay, I understand this better. I'm invested differently.
And the thing is, that makes story is accessible to everyone. And I think that's true really even when you think about Jesus, why his story or message has so much power today, because it's embedded in a story always.
Story has power in it to be transformational.
Right. So I think what we have to do, though, at the beginning of this season is really define what power is. Because I think power means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I think sometimes when people think of power, they think of Stalin or Hitler, or they think of it automatically as something negative. But really, when we're talking about power this season, we want to talk about it as the ability to influence or bring change to any sphere of life. And from a dictionary perspective, it's also been defined as the ability to rule. I like this quote. Ken Myers, who's a journalist, said that power is simply the ability to participate in the stuff-making sense process that is the most distinctive thing that human beings do. So, like, what she said is that humans really are the only creatures with power.
Right.
Because we can make stuff out of nothing.
Right. Stuff making, sense making.
Yeah. And when we define power this way, we recognize that we are the only people who can do this. And like at an elemental level, all of life exhibits power, obviously, right? Like I'm looking outside our window right now and thinking of the grass that's growing in the spring. But in the broadest sense, I guess all of life has power.
The universe is sustained by some kind of power.
But humans exercise power, only humans exercise power in the second sense, that stuff makes sense.
Right.
So a lion can't make sense of a computer, or can't build something.
Or can't address something that's an imbalance and bring about transformation.
Right. Andy Crouch, in his book Playing God, says this: because the ability to make something of the world is in a real sense the source of human well-being, because true power multiplies capacity and wealth. When any human beings live in entrenched powerlessness, all of us are impoverished. And this is really true. The truth of the matter is, from the time we're born, we are all looking for power. And I know some of you might be listening right now saying, well, that's not me. I'm kind of like naturally
a meek person.
Right. But I know this is true because I have 4 kids, and all of them at one point in their life, when I would say, go clean your room or go do this or any number of tasks, they would always come up with, no, you're not the boss of me.
Right.
I'm the boss of me.
Right.
I had my 8-year-old for a long time. He would always say, when I'd say something, well, Mom, you said that Jesus has to be the boss of me. Jesus has not asked me to clean my room, and so I won't.
The big pushback.
Right. I think this entrenched idea that we do grasp for power naturally.
Yeah, from the beginning. Sure, because it's tied to our sense of autonomy and independence. And then that's why we're asking in this season, what does it mean to leverage power in healthy ways? What does it have to do with our discipleship? How do we not just think of power in negatives or in like big categories?
Right. Like I think as a young person, I was given the clear message always, and partly I think because I'm a woman, to be meek and mild and peacekeeping and quiet.
Right.
And further, I was told I needed to learn to submit and turn the other cheek and freely give up my rights. And I remember people quoting different scriptures all the time. And the problem with this always, though, and what I would wrestle with when I'd get into bed at night, is that my personality is completely different from this picture. And I always was worried if I could live up to this, what seemed like an impossible standard.
Right.
Like that my ambition was wrong, that it was a grasp for power, and somehow that like equated me to like
ungodly,
a dictator. And that my own inclination to come into a room and organize the room and sort of commandeer the room was somehow less than godly or holy.
We probably both got those messages somehow, that any leadership gifts we had were not okay. It was like something was wrong.
Right.
And then we translated that theologically in terms of our own discipleship.
Right. And the conversations I heard were often tinged with the sense that power is pretty much a problem.
Right.
And, I can remember as a very young person, like a pre-teenager, hearing all power corrupts. Power corrupts all the time. Yeah,
power corrupts absolutely.
Right. And that being internalized into my very psyche, like to the point where that I thought, yes, the Bible upholds that. But so what we want to explore, I think, this
Oliver
season.
Cromwell?
Yeah, I think
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah, it's been said in so many different ways.
Right, we don't know.
In so many different.
Yeah.
You can Google it.
Okay.
That's what Google's for. So, but I think when you do look at the Bible from the New Testament to the Old Testament, the Bible is dealing with power in every single book, and it is not always describing power as a negative thing.
Right. And it's not just God having good power and all humans that have power functioning negatively.
Right, because I think if we say that it's negative, it leads us to unintentional hypocrisy.
Right.
Because we conceal ourselves and others from how much power we actually have.
Right.
So if power is negative and power is sinful, then what I'm going to do is pretend I have no power.
Right.
So that I seem more holy.
Sure. Even the season 1, the justice episodes were some of the ones that got the most reaction.
Right.
Lots of big aha moments for people. And this would tie, and we'll get into it, I think, later in the season, but just the idea that if power is not all negative, then we probably can't, if we're going to try to be faithful Christians and follow in the way of Jesus, we're going to have to leverage some of our own power in healthy ways. So then you have to get past believing that power is basically bad, and that the best amount of power to have as a follower of Christ would be none. You'd have to turn and see yourself differently, in some ways as a steward of a good gift, and also become more likely to have to think carefully about not misusing and abusing power, because you'd have to get to the place of admitting that you have some.
Right.
I think we can all think of stories where someone has abdicated participation or responsibility, or said, well, I don't want that power, or I don't care somehow, in their posture toward others. Like small reality. Okay. Jess and I both pastor local churches, and the ripple effect, for instance, this is a very small example.
If you're listening and this hurts you,
pay attention, people. Pay attention.
Or just maybe not.
It's the people who bail on their commitment
on Saturday night.
Right.
Or we love you.
Wednesday even, but they've made a commitment to serving on some Sunday team, and then they bail on that because they have no idea of the stress and the ripple impact that they have on others. So that's a small example.
It's an abdication of power.
Right.
You don't actually realize that you had power, and when you say, I'm not showing up to do that.
Right. Sometimes that's for valid reasons, but
sure.
Lots and lots of times in the society we live in, it's
the sun is out, the mountains are calling.
Right. I don't feel like it. So then that has an impact on others.
Don't be mad.
Take that example, that's a very small and sort of trite example of the impact, and then put it on a bigger scale. Say somebody in church leadership who is only considering their own self. They have an affair or some serious sexual sin. I've been dealing with a situation this past year where this is the very horrible reality, criminal behavior that end up devastating hundreds, if not thousands of people, and impacting relationships and also people's relationship with God.
Yeah.
So that's a terrible abuse of power, where a person's only thinking about themselves and not the impact on others. We could probably, all of us, everybody listening, we can think of at least one scenario where something like that has happened. Somebody had a lot of power. They might not have even realized the power they had. They made terrible decisions, and the ripple impact is felt, even beyond that moment, beyond that year, maybe even for entire lifetimes.
Right, and at the root of it, it's abdication of power.
Right.
And so I think as a foundation, I think Christians have to view their power as a gift from God. And I think the most important reason is that while the Bible is scathingly honest about the way human beings can abuse power, the deeper biblical theme is that when power is stewarded correctly, it leads to flourishing. And I think...
Right, pause there for a second. Say that one more time.
Okay.
When power...
The Bible is scathingly honest about the way human beings abuse power. So it doesn't pull any punches. We are prone to wander. That is true.
Right.
We are prone to abuse our power. But the deeper biblical theme, and I think the theme that ties every book of the Bible together, is that when power is stewarded correctly, it leads to human flourishing.
That is the basis. I think that's the thesis of everything we're going to say this season.
Yes.
Very good.
And so when we look at Genesis 1 and 2 in the creation story, so most near ancient narratives are rooted in violence and domination and definitely power. When you look at Genesis, you realize that it's rooted in the idea of goodness and abundance and image bearing. And these are all subsets of power. Power, right. You can't have image bearing without power, and you can't have abundance without power.
And the call to stewardship implies power.
And I think then when you go to the final chapter of Revelation 21, it's about creative power, but also about recreation and reconciling power.
Right.
The power to make all things new, and the astonishing invitation that we all get to be part of this redeemed new earth. And I think if we will see power as a gift from God, I think we'll have deeper resources to understand how we can use whatever power we've been given today in a fruitful way.
Right.
So I think part of our lack of flourishing comes from when we wish we had more power than we do right in this moment.
Right.
So we want to be...
grasping.
Yeah. And then that leads to striving, which leads to selfish ambition.
Yeah.
And that's where ambition gets a bad rap, right?
Right. And
so
then,
it's not the reaching for something more. It's the not stewarding what you have now.
Yeah. So then we'd have to look at the underbelly of motivations for power, which we will get into.
Right.
And the impact relationally.
Yeah.
But if we want to get at that idea of flourishing, we're going to have to talk about ways to be accountable, ways that power can get distorted, the idea of when we substitute something or someone for God, we distance ourselves from God or from true fruitful relationships. All of those things have massive impact on how we steward, kind of how we've been created, who we are made to be.
Right, and I think that has a big impact on the most vulnerable amongst us.
Right.
And I think if we see power as negative, not if we don't see it as a gift at all or as neutral, something that doesn't matter very much, then we're missing our call to use our power for others' flourishing.
Right. So it's not just the self that would flourish, but the whole of humanity. In fact, probably the whole of creation.
Right.
Yeah. Nelson Mandela talked about that, the flourishing for others when we use our power properly. So I think it's going to be very important for us to specifically address power. I think we're pretty obvious straight out of the gate here, but it would have been way easier if we said we were going to do a season all on leadership or influence or even borrow the word authority. And we could say those are really important and they can be beneficial forms of power. But I think those words would have camouflaged what's really at stake. The actual issue of power we need to address head on. And I think while the church seems to maybe want to bury their heads and pretend power dynamics don't exist, let's be candid that at least the academic world has been absolutely enamored with this subject for the last generation. And that's been influenced maybe more recently by Michel Foucault and maybe perhaps even more deeply by guys like Friedrich Nietzsche. Whole disciplines have reoriented themselves around excavating where hidden power lines are found. And I think while both Foucault and Nietzsche have rightly pointed out that power is everywhere, it seems that at the foundation of their belief is this idea that power is essentially about coercion. And that even when it looks like power is life-giving and creative, it actually cloaks in a violent fist in a beautiful glove. So I think we're going to want to address that the philosophical and theological problem by looking at a biblical view of power.
And you don't need to be afraid. I will say this, as we throw out Nietzsche.
Right.
We're not going to be talking deeply. I think the question we want to ask is, how does this land on the ground?
Right.
Like, what does this mean for me on Monday morning when I get up and I feel like I can't even, like, roll my kids to school, and I have things I have to do at my job.
Right.
How does the philosophy and the theme of power actually affect how I live my life?
Right. But because with Down to Earth, we want to make deep theology easily accessible to everyday life, we're going to work hard at not just surface talking about power, but like underneath it. And there'll be people who listen who are way more schooled in philosophy than Jess or I, or, you know, maybe more than 90% of the listeners. But I think it's okay for us to push ourselves a little bit intellectually so that we can get at, okay, what would that look like in real life, real sort of down-to-earth existence? So I think that means we're got to look at power, the whole subject, not just the easy parts. Because otherwise I think it could sound more benign and easily understood as something good. But there's problems, I think, with only focusing on those aspects of power, because all sorts of power don't come necessarily from exercising authority or influence or leadership, which is why we're not just talking about it with those descriptor words.
Right.
There's even things as basic as what it means to have power by being physically attractive, or the power of inherited wealth. Or
I wish I had that power.
Inherited wealth. Or the power of being born with a certain passport or speaking a certain language.
Right. I mean, I think we do have to acknowledge that most of our listeners come from the Western world.
Yeah.
Most of them have a passport that already gives them a certain amount of
power.
The fact that you're listening in English and we're not speaking in some other language.
So we don't want to celebrate that as better than, but we do want to raise the awareness that you're already wielding some disproportionate amount of power that maybe could and should be leveraged.
Right. So, like, I think what it is that we're going to be doing here, there's a bit of tension. And this is why people don't like to talk about it very often, because there is this weird push and pull. Like, I don't want to say that because we live in the Western world, we naturally have so much power, like saying that that's a... But I also don't want to not talk about it and just pretend, oh no, we're the same as everybody else.
Right.
That's not really true either. Right? So to acknowledge, there's two sides to ditch to every truth.
Yeah.
What we want to do is acknowledge the two sets of ditch and keep ourselves somewhere in the middle.
Sure. And then maybe there'll be people who listen who have different cultural backgrounds. Think of maybe Indigenous people in Canada who would revere elders and the power that comes from being old, like the sages in the culture. Their power in a culture like ours, we revere youth or being young, and none of that would really develop into any kind of form of leadership. So I think we could learn some things about how, say, Indigenous people would leverage power in healthy ways through their reverence and respect for elders.
Right.
And then how could that shape us, for the better? And I think we want to address power because we want to know if we're using our power well. Otherwise, we could be at risk of playing God in the very worst ways, or abdicating like we've talked about. We want to expose some of the real dangers, particularly when it comes down to ideas of idolatry and injustice. And we talked about that in season 1, but this time we're going to talk more about those concepts in terms of how they're impacted by power.
I can remember being, as we started addressing you and I talking about that this is maybe where we want to go in season 2. I remember thinking about, as a young pastor, using my power incorrectly. So I was probably about 22 or 23. I'd been pastoring for 5 minutes. But I recognized right away, I mean, I didn't say this out loud, looking back on it now. It was an internal that I had some amount of power. Now, I didn't have great amounts of power, but I could command.
Manipulate?
Yeah, and I think, no, I don't know if manipulate was the word, but I could get people to do what I asked them to do. And I remember we were doing some kind of a Easter presentation, and somebody had yelled at a young man, and I thought it was inappropriate. And to me, Joyce, I thought, oh, I'm gonna like wield my power now.
Okay.
And I remember, now this person has become my friend, and if you're listening, Sylvia, I am still so sorry for this. I just decided that this was going to be the time that I was going to exert pastoral power and authority. And I walked into a situation where I tore a strip off somebody that was very inappropriate for me to do. I look back on it. I'm
Mortified?
I'm mortified now, thinking that I did this.
But you thought you were justified in the moment?
And I think I was bigger than my britches. And I often think that in a world that doesn't respect power, we have a lot of people bigger than their britches. And, I think all the studies will tell us that now Generation Z they don't have a lot of respect.
Zed, we're Canadians.
I lived in America. I'm Z. And this idea, but then I laugh because I think back to myself, and I think partly youth comes with the danger of misappropriating power. It's probably not
immaturity.
Yeah, and part of it maybe is not even youth; it's just humanness.
Yeah.
I think I scared myself that day, though. Like I walked away in the middle of me exercising inappropriate authority. I recognized, oh my word, what am I doing?
Right.
And I have been very aware. Now, that's not to say I'm sure I've misappropriated power many, many times, but I became very aware that we are all one step away from using our power
wrongly.
Yeah. Even when we have very little power.
Yeah.
So, and then I was really aware of it when I became a mom.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Because I was never going to be that shouting mom. I was going to be kind. I remember thinking as a kid, why are all the adults angry all the time? I couldn't understand. Like, why can't they just be happy?
Sure. I mean, there's been good books written about this, but the idea of the shaping of a person as they parent. So maybe lots of our listeners aren't parents yet, but for me, I think people sometimes talk about marriage as like the sandpaper or the mirror that shows you your true self and works out your lumps and bumps or your warts. And I haven't really had that experience. I think living in community did that, but because I got married later, that wasn't.
She was already perfect when she got married.
No,
Kelly, that is a shout out for you.
But when I had
very
kids,
close to Jesus,
I started to see that I have lack of humility that really need work. And it was mostly because I got a very type A oldest who won't do what I tell him to do. And I would get in these big power struggles with him. Less so now that he's 9, but there were moments when he was 3 or 4 and I just think, just because I said so. Right. And I could hear my mom, or my parents, like the echo of that and the infuriation I felt as a child because I felt disrespected. And what did it mean to nurture him and his own independence and in healthy ways have him listen and respect and obey because I knew things he didn't know, but that I would actually be interested and listen to him and his desires. It was very, very hard for me because I wanted to wield the power and what did I want? A kid or a puppet?
Right.
And
some days you want puppets.
Yeah, some days you do, because it's hard dealing with the dynamics.
And I think what that highlights for all of us is that we mask it, but we're all still grasping for power.
Yeah, and we're all still having to work it out in interpersonal relationships.
Right, on the ground. So this is why while Nietzsche is important, we have to ask ourselves, how does this hit the ground for me?
So here's a different example. I remember maybe we talked about this in season 1, but the idea that over and over again, people are most surprised if they've got conflict in their family life. And I'm talking to them as a pastor. I'll often say, okay, so when's the last time you asked your kid for forgiveness? And for parents, they look at me like, have you lost your marbles? Like, tell my kid that they need to obey me or fix this issue with my kid, and I'm going after our own hearts. And I've learned that for myself, but I've recognized just conversations with friends or in my role as a pastor, if I'm meeting with someone for some pastoral counseling, the shock is how often I think we ought to be seeking forgiveness from someone else.
Right.
Which is a letting go of power. A humility and seeking forgiveness in the way of Jesus is inviting, I guess, a posture of surrender in our relationships with one another, where they could say, no, I don't forgive you, or what, like they could have a different response. Anyways, I digress, but I think that is a way of highlighting how do we live this out in real time? Because our power is tied there, and when we don't want to go and seek forgiveness from someone else, it's probably got a root issue in our hearts that has to do with power.
Okay, so I think, though, the reason people don't often ask for forgiveness is because they actually don't admit that they have any power. So we play roadkill. And I think most Christians think of themselves as powerless. And I think we've upheld that as like a spiritual...
good thing.
Yeah. And part of the way we justify our position is by referencing Jesus's incarnation. Okay, so we go back theologically and we often hear that Jesus gave up power. I mean, I've preached messages like this, and in many ways this is true, right? The incarnation was a totally stunning self-limitation,
right,
on the part of Jesus, God, yes. And like Philippians 2, like you said, it went all the way to death on the cross. And death really is the limiter. It's the end of all power. So this is where we get this. God emptied himself. He went on the cross. He died. And this is the central part of the Christian story.
Right.
Now, I think most Christians theologically take that part and then say, so because of Jesus, we must be like Jesus. Therefore, I have no power.
Or I have to empty myself of power.
Of power, right. So therefore, power is evil. But while the whole gospel revolves around the moment of surrender, the New Testament writers also go to great lengths to emphasize Jesus' power in his teaching and healing,
right,
and the way he conferred power on his disciples. I used to always think that was such a juxtaposition. So here was Jesus giving up all of his power, and then he says to the disciples, okay, so now you're going to go in my power and authority.
Right.
And I would read that and think, like, well, you're just about to give up your power and authority. So what does this actually mean for us as Christians? And the resurrection, and when Jesus rose from the dead, I mean, that was the grand display of power.
Right.
Has the most effect on us as Christians.
Yeah.
So I think the harm in speaking as Christians that we're powerless is that it doesn't take a lot of the New Testament seriously.
Right.
Instead, it just takes one aspect and confers it onto our whole lives.
Right.
When really that isn't the full message of the gospel.
Right. So in a sense, what we're saying is it's like using a filter on a photo. If the filter that you overlay over your life as a follower of Jesus is that power is sinful or bad, and to be like Christ or to obey, you have to let go of all power. If that's the filter that underscores, overlays everything, you're going to have some great difficulty. If we only speak about powerlessness, like you're saying, as the call, it wouldn't be taking the whole of the New Testament seriously, like you've said. I think about somebody like Pauline. I talked about her in season 1, who at 85 years of age decided to, really lean into 25 years of investment with poor people.
Right.
And people with profound addictions and mental health issues, and started this little not-for-profit, Jacob's Well. And I realized there's a woman who believed she could affect transformation for individuals and within society because Jesus had empowered her.
Right.
And it didn't matter that she was 85 and wore pearls and a little twin set, Angora sweater thing. I remember walking with her one day into the Brandy's. I don't know if I've told this story, but it's closed now. But it was a notoriously awful, dark, bad bar in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And we didn't go in there very often. We went in the bars every afternoon, Pauline and I. But this day she said, I just feel we're to go into the Brandy's. And she was 85 and I was 29. And so she was trying to school me a little bit in just saying, keep your eyes averted if there's things that you know you shouldn't see. I did not know what she was talking about, but I was just like, okay. She was trying to protect my innocence, but she wasn't saying just because you're young and you're an unmarried woman, we're not going in here. Mm-hmm. She believed that we had power to affect transformation. So we go marching in, and it's dark, right? Dingy, gross, kind of exactly what you would think. No windows, sketchy place.
Sticky.
Yeah, and then we walk in, and there's a bit of a hallway coming in, and then we come around the corner, and there's big screen TVs everywhere, and there's porn on. And now I knew what she was talking about, and I was like, oh, avert the eyes. Like, I didn't even know you could show that stuff in public. But apparently, they did at the Brandy's. And one of the ladies that was working, one of the barmaids, hollered out, shut that trash off! The church ladies are here! And boom, it went off, and the lights went on. And I got a real lesson right then and there about risking obedience to bring light into dark places. Right. Literally, Pauline, as an 85-year-old woman with her lovely diminutive stature, said, I have power to bring something into this place that will push back things that are dark and awful for us. And we had a pretty amazing afternoon in there. Mm-hmm. And that was a great lesson for me, that we are so afraid of that stuff and whatever power it might have over us, right, that we won't go and bring what we have, the presence of Christ, and just the courage that we've been given to affect transformation.
Right. It's like sometimes I think we use the word power in two different ways. Mm-hmm. So most Christians will attest to the fact that, yes, God gives us power. But when I use power in like any kind of political sense, like I have power at my business, or I have power in my family, or I have power in my friend group, that becomes like negative. But I think what we have to realize is it's all the same word. It's all the same concept. That power cannot be dichotomized. Like right now I'm going to do ministry. Therefore, as I stand up at an altar or go or lay hands on somebody, I'm going to have power then. But I can't use any power that would be tied to anything worldly. I think we've dichotomized this idea of power. So then when we read Jesus's words and when we read the New Testament talking about all power has been given to you, we only read it in one sense. We read it in a spiritual sense.
And set aside the rest of our real life.
Which is Gnostic thinking.
Yes.
Absolute Gnostic thinking, which is what Paul writes about in all the epistles. He's railing against Gnosticism, that we cannot have a bifurcation of spiritual life and secular life.
Right. No splitting into two.
And it's why we can have people that pray for people at altars on Sunday morning and beat their wives on Monday night.
Right.
Because we don't see power as the same. It's not the same, even the same concept.
Yeah. It's good. We're going to get into it, right? The whole of season 1, I think we've broken it down. So we're probably going to do something like 4 episodes on different sections. But some of the stuff we've decided to tackle is like philosophical theology, looking at power struggles. We're going to talk about Jesus and power. We're going to talk about Christ's posture influencing us, power in the margins, and the power of the margins.
Right.
Like, that's a really upside down and Christian concept.
Right.
That we'll unpack. And then what Christian leadership and power could and should look like. And then we've got just some reading. Look, some of you are readers like Jess and I, and you're interested in going a little bit deeper on season 2. And so we just thought we'll offer some books that you can track along and read if you want to supplement your learning or your thinking.
Some of these are very dense. We're not going to lie. Some of these you cry while you're reading because you're thinking, I'm never going to get through this book.
Right. So if this is not the kind of reading you want to do, don't even worry about it.
The first couples
we'll post
them.
We'll post this list, but we're going to look at John Milbank, Theology and Social Theory, Oliver O'Donovan, Resurrection, the Moral Order, The Desire of Nations, Marilyn French, Beyond Power, Janet Hagberg, Real Power, Kyle Passawork, Theology of Power, Being Beyond Domination. On and on we could go. Obviously, we're going to look at Jacques Ellul, Money and Power, or Freedom, Love and Power. Yeah, Howard
Peaceable
Boss.
Kingdom.
Yeah. Anita Hill,
Yeah.
Speaking Truth to Power. That's had massive implications socially and politically. Guys like Gustavo Gutierrez.
Nice accent.
Thank you. I gotta do him cred for his language and name. But some of these liberation theologians, out of the Latin American social revolution, came from a theological rootedness in terms of what they understood about power.
And I kind of think if you don't read any liberation theology, you don't have to agree with it all. But it does underscore the idea of power or lack thereof.
Right. I even put G.K. Chesterton on my submissions to this list because some of you have read, C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien. Didn't you just see a movie about him?
I did. It was so good.
Okay.
You need to go watch
I gotta
it.
go see that. But we know some of these guys. Well, Chesterton was their contemporary and one of the Inklings, but he wrote a little bit differently. Some people might have heard of some of his essays or even his Father Brown Mysteries. But I love his book, The Man Who Was Thursday. It's one of my all-time favorite books, which might say something about how weird my brain is. But it is a novel that looks at anarchy and power and creation. So, anyways, I think it's a good one. So if you want to read something that's not philosophical or heavy theology, you could read that novel and wrestle with what's he actually saying underneath it. Mm-hmm. Probably lots of films we watch for the power dynamic at play in any story you're engaged in, whether it's something that comes across your social media feed, something that you're reading in a novel. You just got me to read Washington Black. That was a really interesting novel.
Which is kind of really about power and freedom and what does it really mean
to be free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to have your own power.
Yeah.
I mean, because really, if you think about it, freedom is a result of power.
Yeah.
You cannot be free without power.
Right. And so the backdrop is slavery. And anyways, it won Man Booker, or it was a finalist. I can't remember. But anyways.
Esty Adjudgen.
Yeah. So really, really great. But anything you're engaged in, you're going to start to see, if you listen throughout season 2, hopefully for all of us, Jess and I included, it's going to highlight where the power is at work in healthy and unhealthy ways in us and through us. And maybe we'll grow.
Yeah.
It's good. Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or go to our website at
www.downtoearthpodcast.com. Feel free to leave us a review wherever you find your podcast and spread the word.